Real stories of werewolves, of Dogman from history, from your emails, illustrated and animated with the democratizing magic of machine learning AI. Welcome to Scary Stories.
Dogman versus Wendigo. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I was hiking in the Hiawatha National Forest in the late 80s when I discovered I was suddenly witnessing two impossible beings face each other in the deepening forest gloom, their unnatural presence turning the familiar Michigan wilderness into something dreamlike and ancient. On one side, a creature that seems pulled from mankind's oldest nightmares, a massive humanoid with the muscled shoulders and upright stance of a man, but crowned with the shaggy, snarling head of a wolf. Its teeth are bared in a growl that belongs to neither human nor canine vocal cords, and its eyes hold an intelligence that makes my blood run cold. Across from it stood something even more primordial, a being that seemed to have walked straight out of prehistoric cave paintings. It towered impossibly tall, easily 8 or 9 feet, with limbs that were just slightly too long, too thin to be natural. But it's the head that draws my attention mainly, crowned with a rack of antlers that seem to shift and transform before my eyes. One moment they're the branching antlers of some ancient elk, spreading wide against the darkening sky. The next, they appear to twist and curve into wickedly sharp horns, like something torn from a demon's skull. I couldn't understand what I was seeing, so I found myself trying not to look at the thing. The wolf-headed one, the one resembling a werewolf, I wondered if that might be the Michigan Dogman. I had never heard of the Dogman standing up like a man, though, not back then at least. Still, what else could it have been but a Dogman? The other creature, however, made no sense to me. I felt ill just trying to look at it. In more recent years, friends have suggested that this might have been a Wendigo, but I can't tell you. I'm not of native ancestry, and I don't understand Wendigo legends. Still, I might call it a Wendigo in this narrative here and there, just because I don't really know what else I should call it. Both beings radiated this sick aura of barely contained violence, their postures speaking of imminent conflict. The air between them seemed to crackle with tension, heavy with the promise of violence about to erupt. The wolf-headed creature's muscles bunched and rippled beneath its fur. I am not sure what the other one was doing. It made my eyes tickle just to try to focus on it. I realized I'd stumbled upon something I was never meant to witness. A confrontation between forces that exist in the shadows of our world, in the places between what we know and what we experience in our nightmares. As weird as things had gotten, it had started out as such a normal autumn afternoon in 1989. I was hiking one of my favorite trails in the Hiawatha National Forest, enjoying the way the late September sunlight filtered through the changing leaves. The air had that crisp edge to it that makes everything feel more alive somehow, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. I'd done this particular hike dozens of times before, which is probably why I noticed when things started feeling different. Looking back, I can't pinpoint exactly when the change began. Maybe it was the way the bird songs gradually faded into an unusual silence, or how the familiar trail seemed to take on an otherworldly quality, like when you're dreaming of a place you know well but everything's slightly wrong. The sunlight, which had been so bright and clear, began to take on a strange, filtered quality, as if I was viewing everything through old glass. I remember checking my watch. It was just past 3 p.m., and then looking up to find that the forest ahead of me had transformed into something I barely recognized. The trees seemed taller, their shadows longer and darker than they should have been. Each step I took felt heavier than the last, like I was walking through invisible syrup. That's when I first spotted them through the trees, and my entire understanding of reality shifted permanently. Two creatures that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist, were facing off in a small clearing ahead. My first instinct was to run, but my body wouldn't respond properly. My legs felt disconnected from my brain, and a strange buzzing had started in my ears. I tried to make sense of what I was seeing, grasping for any rational explanation. Had I eaten something strange? A wild mushroom, perhaps? But even as I attempted to piece together my movements from the past few hours, those memories felt slippery and distant, like trying to hold on to water. The more I tried to remember, the more everything seemed to blur together into a haze of uncertainty. I couldn't be hallucinating on a mushroom. I wouldn't have eaten one of those. So what if I were sick in some other way besides being poisoned? But it was only the Wendigo thing that made me feel sick. I could look down and focus on my hands. I could focus on the wood surrounding me. I could smell the air and hear all the sounds encircling me, and my senses were fine. I could even study the Dogman as it dodged and feinted around the larger monster. But when I tried to look at the Wendigo thing itself, then my entire brain felt like it was being turned upside down inside my skull. My body and nervous system were signaling that something was deeply wrong. Panic set in, and the disorientation spread. Soon, even standing became difficult, as if the very ground beneath my feet had become unstable. I found a fallen log, or maybe it found me, and sank down onto its moss-covered surface, my legs trembling with a weakness I'd never experienced before. The forest around me seemed to pulse and breathe in a way that forests shouldn't, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was seeing something not meant for human eyes. The two creatures continued their standoff, seemingly unaware of my presence. The antlered being, if that's what they even were, those constantly shifting crown-like growths above its head, moved with a fluidity that defied physics. Sometimes it seemed to float slightly above the ground, though I couldn't be sure of anything I was seeing anymore. The Dogman, the wolf-headed creature, moved in a more primal way, circling and stalking like a predator, but always upright, always unsettlingly human in its posture. They made sounds. God help me, they made sounds. Not growls or roars or anything I could properly categorize, but something that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and vibrate directly in my skull. I pressed my palms against my temples, trying to keep my thoughts from fragmenting completely. The buzzing in my head grew stronger, and the edges of my vision began to darken. Time seemed to lose all meaning as I watched these two beings regard each other with ancient hostility. The antlered creature took a step forward, or maybe it was more of a glide, its movements so fluid they defied natural law. In response, the wolf-headed being lowered its stance, muscles coiling beneath its fur like springs ready to release. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath. No birds called, no squirrels chittered, even the wind died away to nothing. All that existed was this primal confrontation and my own thundering heartbeat, which seemed impossibly loud in the silence. I watched, transfixed, as the antlers above the taller being's head continued their unsettling transformation. One moment they branched like a massive elk's rack, the next they curved wickedly like a ram's horns. The shifts happened so smoothly that I couldn't tell if I was seeing actual physical changes or if my mind was simply unable to process what I was looking at. Each time I blinked, they seemed different, yet I couldn't quite remember what they'd looked like a moment before. The Dogman began circling to the left, each movement precise and predatory. Its head remained fixed on its opponent, ears flattened against its skull. The other being turned to track it, but not by moving its feet. Instead, its entire body seemed to rotate without actually stepping, like a terrible living statue on a display stand. What struck me most was how wrong everything felt at a fundamental level. These weren't just strange creatures. They were impossibilities that challenged everything I understood about reality. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my body felt disconnected, heavy, as if I was submerged in invisible water. The confrontation escalated in subtle ways. The air began to feel thick and charged, like just before a lightning strike. The dogman's fur bristled, making it appear even larger, while the antlered being seemed to stretch upward, growing impossibly taller. They made those sounds again, those terrible vibrations that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my skull. I pressed my hands against my temples, trying to hold on to consciousness, onto sanity. The very ground beneath me seemed to pulse and waver. My vision swam, and the scene before me began to fragment like a broken mirror, each piece showing something slightly different. In some fragments, I saw antlers, in others, horns. The dogman appeared both muscled and skeletal, both fur-covered and bare. Walking became increasingly difficult. My feet seemed to sink into the earth with each step, though when I looked down, the ground appeared solid. The world tilted and swayed around me like a carnival ride, forcing me to focus all my attention on just staying upright. After what felt like hours but might have been seconds, my knees buckled. I found myself sitting on a fallen log, or at least I think it was a log. The bark beneath my fingers felt both rough and impossibly smooth at the same time, and when I tried to focus on its texture, my vision began to swim. The forest floor appeared to breathe in slow, gentle waves, like the surface of a lake disturbed by a light breeze. Thoughts became harder to hold on to. I tried to remember how I'd gotten here, what I'd been doing earlier in the day. Had I eaten lunch? Breakfast? The memories slipped away like smoke through my fingers. Each time I grasped at a recollection, it dissolved into confusion. I remembered packing my backpack. Or did I? The contents of my morning felt like scenes from someone else's life, viewed through frosted glass. The buzzing in my head grew stronger, drowning out even the unnatural silence of the forest. I tried to focus on the two beings, but they seemed to blur and multiply like reflections in a broken mirror. My eyelids grew heavy, though I fought to keep them open. The weight of unreality pressed down on me like a physical force. Time stretched and compressed like taffy. I might have sat there for minutes or hours. The log beneath me felt less and less solid, as if I was slowly sinking into it, becoming part of the forest itself. The last thing I remember was watching the antlered being's crown shift once more, the points of its appendages reaching toward the darkening sky like grasping fingers. I don't remember passing out, but I remember waking up. Consciousness returned like a slow tide. The first thing I noticed was how utterly dark it had become. Not just the gentle dimness of evening, but the complete blackness of deep night. Disoriented, I found myself still sitting on that log, my entire body stiff with cold, my clothes damp with evening dew. The moon hung high overhead, its silver light filtering through the canopy in scattered patches that made the forest look completely unfamiliar. For several long moments I sat perfectly still, letting awareness seep back into my limbs. My head felt surprisingly clear now, like waking from a fever dream. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on my mind earlier had lifted, replaced by a sharp, almost painful clarity. My watch read 11:47 p.m. Almost 9 hours had passed since I'd last checked it. My fingers trembled as I fumbled for my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating an utterly ordinary clearing. No massive footprints, no broken branches, no sign at all of the impossible confrontation I'd witnessed. The forest floor was undisturbed except for the familiar scatter of autumn leaves. Even the unnatural silence had passed. Crickets chirped their night songs, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called. But something had fundamentally shifted inside me. Despite the normal appearance of my surroundings, I couldn't shake the bone-deep certainty that I'd witnessed something profound and inexplicable. The boundary between what I knew to be possible and what I'd seen had been permanently blurred. My mind felt like a puzzle box that had been taken apart and put back together slightly wrong. Everything still worked, but nothing quite fit the way it used to. I sat there for several more minutes, trying to reconcile the mundane reality around me with the extraordinary events that seemed simultaneously vivid as lightning and distant as a half-remembered dream. With shaking hands, I managed to set up my small tent in a spot not far from where I'd regained consciousness. Every rustle in the darkness made my heart jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched from just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. The familiar motions of securing guy lines and rolling out my sleeping bag felt like going through the motions of normalcy after witnessing something that had changed everything. Sleep was impossible that night. I lay in my tent, every sense hyper-alert, listening to the forest's nighttime chorus that now seemed to carry hidden meanings in its familiar rhythms. My mind kept replaying fragments of what I'd seen, trying to make sense of it all. The antlers that weren't quite antlers, the way the Dogman moved with such terrible purpose, the impossible sounds. Each time I closed my eyes, the images seemed to shift and change, just as those crown-like growths had done during the encounter. Years later, around various campfires, I finally started sharing this story with close friends. That's when I first heard about the Wendigo, an ancient spirit of the northern forests. My friends were convinced that's what I'd seen, the antlered being that seemed to defy physical laws. They told me stories passed down through generations about these creatures, about their territorial disputes with other forest beings, about their ability to distort reality around them. But even now, decades later, I'm not sure what to make of it all. The experience sits in my memory like a stone that doesn't quite match any known mineral, something that exists outside our normal categories of real and unreal. Sometimes I wonder if I slipped sideways that day, caught a glimpse of something that exists in the spaces between what we think we know and what actually is. I still hike those trails. Sometimes when the light filters through the trees just right, or when an unusual silence falls over the forest, I feel that same strange heaviness in the air. But whatever door opened that day has remained closed, leaving me with questions that I've learned to live with, but never truly answer.
If I wear a spinny hat, will I look all hunky? Will I look like that handsome chap from that TV show, The Monkees? Everybody wants a woolen cat, a scary stories, beanie hat. Everybody knows it's a natural fact. A scary stories, beanie hat. Link is in this video's description if all goes according to plan. Available in black, which is like every color all at once, man.
Angie Brave, and true Angie, what would we do without you? Please join me in thanking Angie in the comments for making this episode possible. Angie donated to us using our thanks button located under each of our YouTube videos. It's donations like that which enable us to eat during this period of lowered advertising revenue. And so, we deeply thank our sweet friend Angie for this. For more information about how you can help this channel stay online, here's our international TV spokesmongrel, Henry Lee Dogman. Hank?
Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button. Or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that when it cuts off after I think 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.